There is a silence descending over hundreds of thousands of Russian families, a silence that arrives not with a formal telegram, not with a flag, not with a state funeral, but with nothing at all. A man leaves for what the Kremlin calls a special military operation, and then he simply stops answering his phone. Weeks pass, months pass, and eventually, quietly, his name appears in a regional obituary, or a grave marker in a provincial cemetery, or not at all, because in some cases there is no body to bury and no official acknowledgement that he ever existed as a soldier. This is the dark machinery operating behind the front lines of Europe's largest war since 1945, and its scale, its deliberateness, and its systemic cruelty are only now coming into full view. The number 600,000 is not a figure plucked from thin air. It represents roughly the size of the active Russian force currently deployed to or cycling through the Ukrainian theater, a force that has been replenished, consumed, replenished, and consumed again in a cycle of attrition so relentless that the numbers have become almost incomprehensible. According to a senior NATO official briefing journalists ahead of an alliance defense ministers meeting, there have been 1.3 million Russian casualties to date in the war, 400,000 of those in 2025 alone. But understanding what is happening to those men requires going beyond the arithmetic. It requires understanding the specific weapons that are consuming them, the institutional systems that are feeding them to those weapons, and the deliberate political choices that ensure the slaughter continues. Let us begin with the instrument that has most transformed how soldiers die in this war. On January 28, 2026, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky stated that drones now account for over 80% of Russian casualties. This single statistic rewrites nearly every assumption about modern land warfare. The drone, once a surveillance tool, once an expensive precision strike platform available only to superpowers, has become a mass-produced, cheap, ubiquitous instrument of infantry killing. In July 2025, Ukrainian military units claimed their unmanned aerial systems struck 16,262 Russian soldiers. By October, that figure had risen to nearly 25,000. Then in December 2025, the number rocketed to an astonishing 33,019, verified by drone footage and confirmed by Ukraine's Commander-in-Chief, General Oleksandr Syrsky. To understand what that number means in human terms, 33,000 men equates to nearly half the entire British Army's full-time personnel, gone in a single month. And perhaps most ominously, December 2025 was the first month in which Ukrainian drones eliminated approximately as many Russian soldiers as Moscow was able to recruit. Russia's replenishment pipeline, pulling men from prisons, from ethnic minority regions, from impoverished rural provinces, from contracts signed under coercion, had for the first time been matched and potentially exceeded by the rate of elimination. This is not simply a tactical inflection point. It is a strategic alarm bell. The attrition math that has sustained Putin's war of exhaustion may be approaching its breaking point. Ukraine's unmanned systems forces have announced plans to increase Russian troops struck by drones to 50,000 to 60,000 per month in 2026, which, over a full year, would amount to nearly half of Russia's entire active army. The technology behind these numbers deserves careful attention because it explains the particular horror of what Russian frontline soldiers are now experiencing. Ukrainian FPV and bomber drones carried out nearly 820,000 confirmed successful strikes in 2025 alone, all verified by drone video footage. The fiber optic FPV drone, a weapon that transmits its control signals through a thin filament of glass rather than radio waves, has rendered conventional electronic jamming largely useless against it. Ukraine has delivered over 352,000 fiber optic FPV drones to its armed forces since July 2025 and plans to manufacture over 7 million total drones in 2026, 583,000 per month, a 55% increase over 2025 production levels. For a Russian infantryman moving across open ground in Donetsk, this means operating inside a surveillance environment where almost every movement is observed, tracked, and potentially targeted by a weapon that cannot be jammed, cannot be detected until it is feet away, and costs a fraction of what it takes to train and deploy the soldier it kills. But the drone war is only one dimension of the darkness descending on Russia's military force. To understand the full picture, one must look at where these 600,000 soldiers are coming from, because the answer reveals a system of institutional coercion that would be almost unbelievable were it not so extensively documented. The Russian government, facing mounting losses, has intensified coercive recruitment tactics targeting prisoners, conscripts, and ethnic minorities from remote regions and Central Asian migrant communities. Male inmates across prisons in the Volga region, including Tatarstan and Bashkortostan, as well as parts of Siberia, describe routine beatings, psychological torture, and threats aimed at forcing them into military service. These men are funneled into the so-called Storm Z assault units, penal formations deployed in the most lethal sectors of the front. Storm Z personnel consistently report receiving no combat training, simply being given old surplus equipment, if anything, before being shipped to the front, where most members die in their first operations. Putin himself has reportedly referred to these men as meat. Since 2023, 90 prisons across Russia have shut down as convicts were sent to war en masse. The prison population, a reservoir of expendable manpower that the Kremlin tapped to avoid a politically catastrophic third general mobilization, has now been so thoroughly depleted that the Institute for the Study of War noted in February 2025 that Russia had mostly exhausted its prison population and could no longer generate significant forces from inmates. The Kremlin has therefore turned to other vectors, recruiting from ethnic republics where resistance is harder to organize, offering financial incentives to police officers who deliver new recruits, and quietly adjusting legislation to blur the line between conscription and contract service. In October 2024, President Vladimir Putin signed a law allowing individuals to sign military contracts before their trials, formally legalizing recruitment from detention cells. For those who survive the front and return home, a different catastrophe awaits them, one that is unfolding in psychiatric wards, in domestic violence statistics, and in the quiet desperation of men who have been through industrial-scale combat with no psychological support infrastructure to receive them. In the fourth year of the war, reports of post-traumatic stress disorder and alcohol addiction among both contract soldiers and mobilized troops are rising sharply. A 2025 study from Novosibirsk found that of 130 servicemen hospitalized at a psychiatric facility, nearly 1 in 4 had been admitted after attempting suicide. Russia's 2022 mobilization drive more than doubled suicide risk overall. For soldiers with clinical PTSD symptoms, the risk rose more than 5-fold. Russia has no meaningful veteran support system. The cultural stigma around mental health treatment in the Russian military is so severe that most men suffering from combat trauma will never be diagnosed, never receive treatment, and will instead metabolize their damage through alcoholism, domestic violence, and social collapse, a slow-motion casualty wave that will ripple through Russian society for decades, even after the shooting stops. Meanwhile, in the air and at sea, the strategic picture is shifting in ways that extend this conflict far beyond the Ukrainian front. On June 1, 2025, Ukraine executed Operation Spiderweb, a coordinated drone strike using 117 autonomous drones launched from concealed trucks on Russian territory, targeting 5 separate Russian air bases across 5 time zones. According to 2 U.S. officials speaking to Reuters, about 20 military aircraft were hit in the attack, 10 of which were destroyed. According to the Financial Times, the damaged and destroyed aircraft made up around 20% of Russia's operational long-range aviation fleet. Aircraft like the Tu-95 and Tu-22M3 bomber platforms that cannot be replaced because they have not been manufactured since the dissolution of the Soviet Union, were destroyed not by advanced Western weapon systems, but by autonomous drones concealed in commercial trucks. The psychological and strategic shock of that operation has reverberated through Russian military planning ever since. What does all of this mean for NATO, for Europe, and for the global security architecture? The strategic implications run in two directions simultaneously. On one hand, Russia's professional military corps, its experienced officers, its combined arms competencies, its institutional warfighting knowledge, has been severely degraded. Russian forces are advancing at an average of between 15 and 70 meters per day in their most prominent offensives, slower than almost any major offensive campaign in any war in the last century. The army that might threaten NATO's eastern flank is a fundamentally different and lesser instrument than the one that crossed into Ukraine in February 2022. On the other hand, Russia has demonstrated a terrifying institutional capacity for absorbing losses and continuing to fight. Through coercion, through foreign manpower from North Korea and Central Asia, and through a war economy that, while strained, has not yet broken. Russia's economic growth slowed to 0.6% in 2025, manufacturing is declining, and inflation remains stubbornly high, but the economy has not buckled. The dark truth at the center of all these numbers is a political one. Every one of the approximately 600,000 men currently cycling through Russia's war machine in Ukraine is there because Vladimir Putin has calculated that their deaths are a more acceptable political cost than the alternative, negotiating an end to a war he cannot afford politically or symbolically to lose. The Kremlin has outsourced the dying to Russia's prisons, its ethnic periphery, its poorest and most voiceless communities, and its imported foreign soldiers. It has built an entire apparatus of institutional deception to keep this truth from the Russian public. And it has bet, not unreasonably given the evidence so far, that the world's attention will eventually tire before its own capacity to absorb loss does. Whether that bet ultimately proves correct will determine not only the fate of Ukraine, but the shape of European security for a generation. The men disappearing into that machine, coerced, deceived, sacrificed, and often unacknowledged, are the human cost of that calculation, and the accounting, when it finally comes, will be staggering.